Hello and welcome to The Wargamer, and you're joining me for another Warhammer 40k painting tutorial. This time I'll be showing you how to paint the Scarab Occult Terminators using the Citadel range of paints to do so. Now before I go on, I just want to say a huge thank you to Alchemist Workshops for donating the miniatures for this tutorial. So here we have the Scarab Occult Terminator that I'll be painting in this tutorial. Now I've gone for the Sorcerer variant because it gives me some really good opportunities to show you how to paint the cloak and also some of these white areas on the miniature as well. Now I've primed it using a grey spray primer because it will give me a really good base colour in which to build up from when painting these bright colours. Now the first task in painting this miniature is to paint the armour. Now one thing you may notice that I've done is I've kept all the components separate. So I've got the torso here, I've also got the arms there in two separate pieces, and then also the legs are a separate item as well. Now the first task is painting the armour, and the fur colours we'll be using for that is a base coat of Thousand Suns Blue, followed by a wash of Ahriman Blue. Then we'll start to highlight first of all with Ahriman Blue, and then finally with Baharoth Blue. Now Thousand Suns Blue has been specifically formulated for use on these rubric Space Marines, so of course this is why we're using it on the mix. It gives us really nice blue colour. Now I've mixed in some water with this mix just to improve the flow of the paint off the brush, but also what this will do is when we leave this first layer to dry, it actually won't cover entirely, but when we apply a second coat over the top, will actually result in a really nice and even coverage that acts as a perfect base coat that we can build up from in later steps. Now I wouldn't worry too much at this point about overspilling onto the other areas because we'll be painting over them in later steps. So just make sure you get into all these recesses and paint all of these blue areas on the miniature. So here you can see the Thousand Suns Blue has given us an excellent base coat in which to build up from. Now the next step is to apply a glaze of Ahriman Blue across the surface, and this will have two effects. It will really enrich the blue of the miniature. It will also pull slightly into the recesses and give us some better definition on these details. Now I would recommend mixing in 1 part Lamia Medium to 1 part Ahriman Blue, simply because it gives you a little bit more control. So if you apply the first coat, as you can see I'm doing here, and you feel that it's dark enough, then you're okay. But if you find that it's not dark, if it's not dark enough for your preference, then you can just apply another coat over the top once it's dried. So it generally just gives you a little bit more freedom to experiment really with to how much Ahriman Blue you want to apply over the surface. And I'll be applying this across the entirety of the miniature wherever you've painted the blue armour. With the Baharoth Blue glaze completed, you can see we've got a very fine blue line around the edges here, and also a very rich blue colour on the armour itself. Now the next step is to pick out the edges, and this time I'll be using the Ahriman Blue, and you just want to be very carefully with a small amount of paint on your brush. Just run your brush along the edges of the miniature like so, and I've only got a small amount of paint on here because it gives a lot more control as well. So just run it across, hold your brush parallel to the surface like so. I'm just going to be applying this highlight across the entirety of the miniature wherever we have an edge. Now the final step in painting the armour is to pick out the very corners. So for example I'm going to be focusing around this top corner here, very harsh corners like this, and we'll be using the Baharoth Blue on these corners. So as you can see I'll be applying a small amount just onto the very corner itself and then feathering it out across the surface, across the edge. I'll be focusing this around, like I said, just the top edges of the miniatures, wherever you've got corners, things like that. We really want to enhance these hard edges like so. Now if you're painting the Sorcerer of the unit like I am here, you'll be wanting to paint the robes next. Now I'll be painting the outside of the robe first of all. Now I'll be starting off with a base coat of Screamer Pink, followed by a layer of Wazdakka Red before a wash of Druchii Violet, and then finally a fine highlight of Screamer Pink. So for this step I'm just going to be applying my Screamer Pink across the entirety of the surface. As you can see here I've mixed in some water again. If you're using a wet palette you shouldn't need to, as this will be should be sufficiently watered down for your purposes here. And then I'm going to be applying this coat over the entirety of the robe, and then once this is dried I'll then be applying a second coat over the top, again watered down. Now with the base coat of Screamer Pink completed, the next step is to apply a layer of Wazdakka Red. Now I've created a mixture of 1 part Lamia Medium to 1 part Wazdakka Red, and this will really create a nice transition between the Wazdakka Red and the darker Screamer Pink. Now I'm focusing this layer around the ridges in the robes like so. First of all starting on the very tips and then kind of feathering the way down as we get towards the bottom as well. And by mixing in the Lamia Medium, it really helps with this blending process that we've got going between the lighter reds and the darker kind of wine red that we've got is the base colour. So we're doing this across the entirety of the cloak, picking out the folds and leaving the darker colour visible in the recesses. So now, whilst we've got a nice blend between the Wazdakka Red and the Screamer Pink, we want to tie the two colours together a little bit more, to make them a little bit more similar. So I'm going to be applying a wash of Druchii Violet across the entirety of the robes. And this will have a dual effect. It'll not only tie the two colours together, but also pull into these recesses and really enhance the shading that we've got going on there as well. Now, I wouldn't apply it straight out of the pot. Generally speaking, it's best to water down the wash slightly. I've mixed in roughly 1 part water to 1 part Druchii Violet, and then if you feel that it's not quite strong enough afterwards, you can always apply a second layer. This is a great thing about watering down your paint. As you can see, I'm just making sure I follow the line of the cloak, so I'm going from the top of the cloak down to the bottom, and this just helps to remove any streaks that we get building up. Now, the very final step in painting the robes here is to pick out the extreme edge of these folds here. So I've got a small amount of the pink horror just on the tip of my brush here. So I'm very carefully dragging the brush along these surfaces. If you mix in a small amount of water for this step, it makes it a lot easier, and it might not seem like I'm applying much. I'm just going to apply a little bit more to my brush there. But generally speaking, if you want to get a fine line like this, the smallest amount of paint possible on your brush really helps to go a long way. It just means you're not going to be overspilling accidentally onto other areas. With the outside of the cape completed, the next step is to start painting the inside. Now, we're starting off with a base coat of Rakhar Flesh, followed by a wash of Seraphim Sepia, before beginning some highlights, first of all with the Shabti Bone, and then finally White Scar. I'll be tackling this base coat in much the same way as the previous steps. So, for example, I've watered it down slightly, and I'm just going to make sure that once this first layer has dried, I'll be applying a second layer over the top and give us the best base coat possible. Now, you should be quite careful especially when you get close to the inner armor sections around this here, and also around the edges as well, because we want to kind of ideally keep the red color around the edges and just have this on the inside section. However, just when you get close to these edges, just reduce the amount of paint on your brush and just be a lot more gentle with the application. With the Rakhar Flesh base completed, the next step is to wash over the inside of the cloak with Seraphim Sepia. Now, again, I've mixed in some water with this mixture, as because it generally is easier to apply two thin mixtures of the wash than applying one straight out of the pot. It gives you better control and avoids streaking across the surface as well. Now, the intention of this wash is to pull into the recesses, and again, as with the outside of the cloak, I'm kind of following the direction of the cloak itself. So I'm emanating from the top there and working my way down to the bottom. Then once this layer has dried, I'll be applying a second coat, and then we want to ideally to pull into the recesses and really create some nice shading in those dips in the cloth. With the Seraphim Sepia wash dry, we can see you've got this much darker colour in the cape. Now, we want to bring up the lightness a little bit, so what we're going to do, we're using our Ushabti Bone, and I've mixed in 1 part Lamium Medium to 1 part Ushabti Bone for this mixture, and this will create some really nice blending between the two colours. So I'm focusing this again on the folds, and then feathering it out as I get into the recesses. So this will create essentially the effect of shading in the recesses where there's like shadows and the darker brown is visible, and then towards the outside of the cape and towards the bottom it will actually get lighter with the Shabti Bone. Now, the final step of painting the inside of the robes is to apply a very small line of White Scar on some of these extreme folds here. So I've mixed in some water with my White Scar just to thin down the mixture. I'm going to be running my brush parallel to the edge like so, just creating a slightly lighter edge highlight, you can see there. I'll be doing this along the other edges of the folds, and also actually the edges of the robe itself, just along and then down at the bottom as well. With the cloak finished, the next step is start painting the white areas of the miniatures. This includes these tabards that we've got flowing from the chest of our sorcerer, but for the rest of your Terminators it'll just be the actual loincloth hanging from the waist. Now, we're starting off with a base coat of Celestra Grey, followed by a glaze of Ahriman Blue, before finally highlighting first of all with Ulthuan Grey, and then finally White Scar. The Celestra Grey will create a really nice light base coat that we can build up from, and we can create a nice white colour. As you can see, it's a lot lighter than the actual grey base coat that I've got on here for the primer, and it covers really nicely because it is a base paint, but just be careful especially around the tops here when you're actually painting around the armour. You don't want to overspill onto the armour that we've already painted. Following the Celestra Grey base coat, we want to achieve a very subtle blue tone to this white cloth. So I've got my Ahriman Blue here, and I've mixed in 1 part Ahriman Blue to 1 part Lamium Medium, and I'm going to be applying this over the entirety of the cloth. You can see it gives us a very subtle and very pale blue colorization to it. It also pulls slightly into the recesses and the folds of the cloth. And we don't want to apply too much. We don't want to apply it straight out the pot, as it will make the cloth far too blue for our needs here. Just want to make a nice subtle blue layer over the surface. With the Ahriman Blue dry, the next step is to apply a layer of Ahriman Grey over the surface. Now I'm going to be picking out the raised sections first of all, using the Ahriman Grey just along these edges. They're quite easy to do so. Again, just be careful when painting close to the areas that we've already painted. And then when we actually finish that, I want to pick out some of these raises and folds in the cloth itself. Mixing in water or some Lamia medium will really help in doing this as well. So just on the inside there, and again just along the edge like so. As you can see, we're actually lightening up the colour of the fabric now and achieving that white look that we're aiming for. So one of the final steps in painting the white areas is to just very carefully highlight them using white Scar, and mixing in a small amount of water will really help to control the flow of the paint off the brush here. I'm just going to be using this to pick out some of the extreme edges, especially along the edges of this particular tabard, and then also towards the top as well. If you're steady-handed enough, you can also pick out just some small sections like so. With the white cloth areas completed, the next step is to start painting some of the yellow bands that we've got dotted about the miniature. So we've got some on the headdress here and also some on the shoulders as well. Now I want to get a nice yellow colour that will contrast nicely against the blue. So we'll be starting off with a base coat of Avalon Sunset, followed by a wash of Cassandora Yellow, before finally highlighting with Uriel Yellow. So using a thin brush with a small amount of Avalon Sunset on the tip, I'm going to be picking out some of these panels like so. And we'll be doing the alternating panels, as you can see I'm doing here. I wouldn't worry too much if you do overspill. You can always neaten up some of these edges later on. Some of them are quite tricky as well. I mean, this is why we're doing the panels before we actually start painting all of the gold areas, because then we can quite easily overpaint them. So mix in a small amount of water. It'll help you to control the paint on these sections, but also give you much better control in terms of making sure you get a really nice and even surface to work from. With the Avalon Sunset base coat completed, the next step is to just wash over the yellow stripes that we painted in the last step using the Cassandora Yellow. And I'm just focusing this mainly so it pulls into the recesses. We want it to darken the colour slightly to create some nice transitional colours as well. It'll really help to bring out this yellow colour, especially against the blue later on. So basically make sure you've got enough on your brush just to pull into the recesses, but don't apply too much because you don't want it to pull over the blue areas ideally. The final step once the wash is dried is to pick out a very small line using the Uriel Yellow. I'll be focusing this along the top edge of these panels here. Again, it doesn't matter too much if you overspill onto the edging here because we'll be painting over that later stage with the gold, but it's just mainly important to not overspill onto the blue areas. But if you do, then it's fine just to go over again with the paints we used in the previous sections. So that concludes the painting of the yellow areas on the miniature, and you can see I've also done it on the actual arm itself. Now we're painting the black areas of the miniature now. Now this includes some of the actual Khopesh main structure as well, not the blade itself, but the main kind of structure of the weapon. And this is also for the stock of the bolters and any other areas on the miniature that you want to paint black. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Abaddon Black, and then a first highlight of Eshin Grey, before a final highlight of Dawnsione. So you should have no issue painting the Abaddon Black base coat over the grey primer that we applied at the beginning of the process, but just mixing in a small amount of water here will allow you to not only quickly cover these large flat areas, but it'll also give you a much more smooth and even coat, and especially around these detail areas help you to avoid obscuring these raised sections. With the black base coat achieved, the next step is to very carefully edge highlight the black areas using Eshin Grey. Now Eshin Grey is quite a dark grey, so it won't stand out too much against the black and it won't look strangely bright, but we're going to be picking out all of the edges very carefully. So I'm just running my brush parallel to the edge itself, just a small amount of paint on the tip of the brush, and this will just create a nice thin grey highlight. The final step in painting the black areas is to apply a very focused highlight of Dawnsione. I'll be applying this mainly around the corners of the actual weapon here, just along the lines that we already painted Eshin Grey in the previous step. Just small dots and small corners, focusing it around the top sections of the black areas as well, and this will just reflect light hitting it from the top. With the black areas completed, the next step is to start painting the silver areas of the miniature. Now on these Terminators, this includes the blades and also the bolters as well. In this case, it's going to be actually the blade section that we've got here, and also the pipes that run the length of the arm. There's also some vents on the back of the Terminator that you'll need to paint in this next step as well. Now I want quite a nice bright silver, so we'll be starting off with a base coat of Ironbreaker, followed by a light wash of Nuln Oil, before finally highlighting with Stormhost Silver. So the first task is to apply the base coat of Ironbreaker. This is quite a bright silver, which will act as a really nice starting point that we can use to create an even brighter silver with the application of the Stormhost Silver later on. Now I'm just being very careful when painting with the metallic, as it can be quite difficult to overpaint any spillage that you might get. So just be very careful when applying this across the miniature. Just use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush. Following the base coat, we now want to apply a light wash of Nuln Oil across the silver areas, and you can see it's a very subtle wash that I'm just applying here. We want it just to mainly pull into the recesses and enhance the shading towards the inner sections, so just apply it lightly over the surfaces and mix in a small amount of water just to thin it down as well. Now the very final step in painting the silver areas is to very carefully pick out the edges of the silver using Stormhost Silver, and Stormhost Silver is a very bright silver, so this will create a really nice bright sharp edge, especially around this blade that we've got here. So I'm focusing mainly around the serrated teeth for this stage, and when you actually come to paint some of the other silver areas in miniature, such as the pipes along here, what you want to do is you want to run the brush just like so, perpendicular to the actual pipe itself, and just creating some small horizontal lines as I'm doing here. With the silver metallic area, with the silver areas of the miniature completed, the next step is to start picking out the gold details on the miniature. Now I'll be starting off with a base coat of Retributor Armour, followed by a layer of Liberator Gold, then I'll be washing over the gold areas using Reikland Flesh Shade, before finally highlighting with Stormhost Silver. So as with the Ironbreaker base coat, this stage is mainly going to be applying the Retributor Armour base coat across the surface. It should cover really nicely over the grey primer as well, as it is a base coat. It is a base colour, sorry. Now, I would recommend mixing a small amount of water here, especially when you come to paint some of the more intricate details of the miniatures. You want to have the most control over the brush as possible, because it can be quite difficult to over paint the areas if you spill them, especially over the blue. So just be very careful and take your time, and just use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush. Now at the moment the gold areas are very bright, so we want to turn them down slightly. So I'm going to be using the Liberator Gold here. I'll be using it as part highlight and also part layer. So I'll be applying it over some of the larger flat surfaces like so, leaving the Retributor Armour visible in the recesses still, just kind of focusing it more towards the tips and the edges. It gives us some really nice transitions of colour in the actual gold itself. It really creates some nice depth there. I'm doing the same across the rest of the miniature, again focusing around the edges for some of the smaller areas, but if you've got a large flat area, then focus on the flat areas but then leave it visible, the darker colours visible in the recesses. Following the application of the Liberator Gold, the next step is to apply a watered down wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. Now I'd recommend mixing in roughly 1 part Reikland Flesh Shade to 1 part water. When we apply this over the surface, you can see here around the details, it's going to pool into the recesses and create a real nice subtle shadow just where we've got these detailings, as you can see I'm just doing here. Just be careful not to overspill onto the non-gold areas. Now the final step in painting the gold areas is to very carefully highlight the edges using Stormhost Silver. So again I'm just going to be running the brush parallel to the edges like so, and just creating this very slight and subtle silver line along the edges. And this will create a really nice shiny gold effect when we've completed it. With the gold areas completed, the next step is to start painting some of the eyes across the miniature. Now there are 2 different sets of eyes. The eyes on the armour will be painting red, and the eyes on the weapons will be painting in a green. Now to paint the red eyes, we're going to be using a base coat of Mephiston Red, followed by a highlight of Wild Rider Red. Then we'll be applying a wash of Carroburg Crimson before finally finishing off with a dot of White Scar. Now when moving from a metallic to a non-metallic, make sure that you clean your brush thoroughly and replace your water, as you don't want to get the metal flakes in your matte paint like we're doing here. So I'm just being carefully applying the small red eye like so. Just mixing in a small amount of water really help to control the paint here, and just use a small amount of paint on your tip of your brush like I've got here. It'll really help prevent any overspilling. Now I'll be painting this across the entirety of the armour wherever there is an eye, apart from those found in the helmet. Following the base coat of Mephiston Red, the next step is to apply a small line of Wild Rider Red across the bottom of the eye like so, leaving the Mephiston Red visible for the most part, but just a small line of the brighter orange red along the bottom there. Next up, we want to apply the wash of Carroburg Crimson over the eyes, and this will just be focusing into the recesses and really bringing out the red, bright red of the colour of the eye, making it look glowing almost. It'll also pull it into the small recess in the centre of the eye where the pupil would be, and it'll really bring out the detailing there as well. The very final step in painting the eye is to apply a small dot of white scar. Now I'm going to be focusing mainly towards the top left here and just apply a very light dab of paint, like so, and this just creates the illusion of a shiny surface. So next up, we'll be painting any of the eyes on the weapons and also the helmet as well. Now we'll be starting off with a base coat of Sybarite Green, followed by a highlight of Ghostblaster Green and a final highlight of Ulthuan Grey. As with the application of the Mephiston Red, I'm just going to be applying this Sybarite Green across the entirety of the eye. Again, just being careful not to overspill into the gold areas we've already painted. And I've mixed in just a small amount of water again here, just to improve the flow of the paint off the brush. Following the base coat of Sybarite Green, the next step is to highlight the eye using the Ghostblaster Green. It's very carefully picking out the sections along the top here. You want to leave the darker colour visible in the recesses still. Now the final step in painting the eyes is to apply some small dots of Ulthuan Grey. Now this effect will be more noticeable on a larger eye, such as the Sorcerer's Staff. However, for this case, we're going to be focusing our attention to the top two corners of the V that makes the pupil. So I'm just going to be focusing one dot just there, and then one slightly to the left of it as well. And then, like I said, this will be much more visible, much more prominent on the larger eyes on the miniature, but for these small sections, just a small amount of Ulthuan Grey along the top should do it. And here we have the completed Scarab Occult Terminator. Now whilst I focus on the Sorcerer miniature, you could use the exact same techniques on the other Terminators, or even the Rubric Marines. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please do let me know in the comments below, and also hit the subscribe button to get up to date with all of my future videos. Additionally, you can find out what projects I'm currently working on by following me on Facebook and Instagram, which you can find links to in the description. And again, a huge thank you to Alchemist Workshops for providing the Terminators for this tutorial. If you're looking to pick up Games Workshop products for over 20% off the RRP, you should definitely check those guys out, and there's a link on screen now and also in the description below. Now these tutorials take many hours to produce, and you can really help me in producing future content by supporting me over on Patreon, which you can find a link to on screen now and also in the description below. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my previous Warhammer 40k painting tutorials. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.